we'll just start with maybe any questions from last week. We had Catherine Bunting-Howarth, and we messed up the video, so she's not going to be she's not going to be on the blog and the video site. So if you one show only, no video. Does anybody have any questions about that? She talked a lot about permitting and policy. Used a lot of examples from Delaware and Great Lakes. Okay, so infrastructure news from this week. Sarah submitted some also, which are up on Blackboard if you want to see any of these things. I don't have them here, but if you want to view them, they're pretty cool. One is a video on a Florida community and their attempt to address sea level rise and infrastructure. I didn't watch the whole thing, but for those of you who did.
At least they seem to acknowledge the reality.
Right.
So good start.
Unlike North Carolina, it said that you can't use science. Florida seems to acknowledge that something's happening. So, and the other thing that's up there is a new site called on data.gov/climate. That is actually pretty cool, and there's some stuff in there about infrastructure maps and where. Again, I didn't look at it too much, but infrastructure maps and climate preparedness and things like that. So if you want to see those links, go to Blackboard and check it out. Anybody else have any other news of the week that we should know about? No? All right. So now on to our news of the week. Mini quiz of the day. Does anybody know what this is? The simplest word you could describe this with? 2-to-1 silica layer, interlayer.
Buckyballs.
Yeah, it's not buckyballs.
Kaolinite?
Even simpler.
Clay.
Clay. Okay, so we're looking at clay.
Kaolinite is the one.
Is a form. Kaolinite's 1-to-1? I thought it was 2.
No,
Right.
kaolinite.
Well, I think this is bentonite. So you have 2-to-1 silica layer. You're looking at basically clay. So when you're to go to a river or a lake or anywhere really, and you were to feel the clay in your hands, this is what you're feeling. You have these different layers of molecules. And does anybody know? So this is one sort of piece of clay, and this is another piece of clay. And what are these supposed to be? Anybody know? Except for you. What's the blue stuff?
Water?
It's water, right. So the clay particles have a charge, and you get these waters of hydration that form around the clay particles. And the reason why I bring this up this week, I don't have a clicker. So since this is what the structure of clay is like, and clay is pretty much everywhere, this is something that can happen when that water gets in between two sheets of clay. So this is essentially saying how water makes clay slippery. It's almost like ice skating, right? In the sense that there's pressure between these two different sheets because again you're underground. And this water layer in between, and that creates this sort of this ability to slip between two different layers. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because of this that happened just a couple of days ago. This is the landslide in Washington State. So you can see this large portion of sort of the mountainside here slipped down. The bend in the river was here. I think now there's more than 10 people died, lots of injuries. Homes and roads were pretty much just washed aside with the landslide. And they're actually also now worried about the landslide. The debris from the landslide made its way into the river, and there's also a bit of a natural dam there as well. So they're worried about what, if that breaks, what's that going to do to that pulse of water, and what's that going to do to downstream infrastructure like bridges that may not be constructed to modern standards and things like that. So that was the infrastructure news of the week. That's really all I have for the most part. I did read some of the newspaper reports. They say things like caused by groundwater saturation due to heavy rain. So again, as soon as you have that pressure on top of the clay layers, and if you can get that interlayer of water in there, what used to be maybe quite solid when it was dry is now actually very slippery when it's wet. And these are problems in large parts of the West especially. I know in California, like the hills of Oakland and east of LA and stuff like that, there's always issues. If it rains a lot, that area has a lot of clay soils. They're 2-to-1 clays, it matters. And so you can get these landslides happening.
The interesting thing that on the news hour last night, I was just looking at a picture of the Times. When you look at the before picture, you can see that whole thing has already slipped. Because you can see scarring all around the outside of it. Didn't slip that much.
It slipped 8 years ago.
Yeah, and then the guy
Same
from
place.
University of Washington, a geologist who was trying to explain why geologists are important to society. You did a good job too. But he was saying it slipped many times. It's like I don't know, he said every few years it flips. So it was interesting. But they were saying that most of the houses were damaged. They weren't at the bottom of that. They were across the river. So it wasn't just kind of falling down. It was falling down and kind of sliding along that did all the damage. Because they were saying, shouldn't have the property owners known that they shouldn't have been in the way of this landslide?
Right.
But he was saying it would be pretty difficult to kind of think about that and that kind of information. So
Right.
I thought that was interesting in terms of hazards and trying to figure out how to tell the public what kind of hazard they might be facing.
But I mean, that also points to the fact that we are increasingly living in spaces where we never used to.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason we say when a tree falls in the forest sort of thing. I mean, that happens all the time, but now we seem to be, right below the tree that falls.
One of the reports said it was glacial deposits, but it'd be interesting to look at it more because that part of Washington State has a lot of very unstable material because of volcanic eruptions. Because when you get those volcanic eruptions, you can get massive mud flows going on, and then they don't necessarily make it all the way down the mountain.
And I'll have to qualify as well, which is, there was nothing, I didn't see any evidence that this was because of a 2-to-1 clay area. I didn't necessarily know that there's a direct link between the clays and the types of clays and this particular landslide, but I know that is an issue with landslides in general.
It would be a 2-to-1 layer clay.
Yeah, I would think, I was just saying because I didn't see it.
In that position in Washington State.
Yeah, sure.
So.
So it sort of opened up the broader question too, which is, are there other examples of us putting buildings and infrastructure in pretty unstable locations? A couple weeks ago we talked about the flood maps in Binghamton and how we pretty much throw buildings in the flood zone all the time. That's that's about as unstable as it gets. Any other examples?
There were a bunch of landslides after the Windswept earthquake in 2008.
Okay. Yeah.
Similar idea, with lots of sharp topography, and they just went right after the earthquake.
So if you're in an earthquake-prone area, where should you and shouldn't you be building? That type of thing. Also thinking about, I guess sea level rise in general. If you're building on the coast, New Orleans, stuff like that. So. Okay. So that was the news. We'll get on to today's speakers, our own Chelsea and Lauren. So we have Chelsea Morris and Lauren McPhillips, both with the Biological and Environmental Engineering Soil and Water Lab, students of Todd Walter, who we heard speak earlier. Chelsea had a fellowship with the US EPA working on surface water quality standards. Is that right? Okay. And Lauren, you've worked before for the USGS. So you have a good perspective on how some of our national agencies are working on different things. And I'll leave it to you guys.
Oh, one other thing.
Oh, sorry, yes?
I'm just thinking, do we have we have some undergraduates here about the USGS is looking for someone.
Sure, okay. So we know that the USGS, the Water Science Center here in Ithaca is looking for an intern for the summertime. It involves some sampling, some data entry, things like that. I don't want to describe the job too much because I don't really know what it entails. But if you're interested, maybe come talk to myself or Susan after class. So. We are also, we also have a position open for summer interns. Deval's been an intern before.
Great, do it.
Thanks for the ringing endorsement.
Yeah. So don't tell anyone. It's for undergrads, yeah. Although, I did get a question about, is it possible to have grad students?
Yeah, that'd probably be harder for us.
Right.
I don't know about the USGS though.
Yeah.
We just.
So we'll go and pull that up. So most of this presentation that Lauren and I are gonna give, or at least my half of the presentation, comes from that experience that, working at EPA, sort of learning the Clean Water Act as an engineer. Coming from that perspective was very interesting, right? So I'm gonna go a little bit over what our last speaker went over. I'm gonna kind of give it my own flavor. I was in the water quality standards division, so we were working on, we were the portion that decided what the criteria would be for water bodies under the Clean Water Act. Not drinking water standards, but standards to protect human health and aquatic life. And then this presentation, I didn't put it on there because I'm not sure she would like that, but this presentation was also built and put together with help from another student. She already graduated and she now is doing the same thing at EPA. She has a fellowship there and she works in the Green Infrastructure branch, which is 5 people. So it's small at EPA. There's lots of people, in other divisions who are interested in green infrastructure and part of policy discussions, but there are really only a small core of people working on this, at least from the regulations point of view. So our outline for today is we're going to do a little bit of the review. I hope I don't bore you on that too much. Lauren, in preparing this presentation, Lauren was like, "You're geeking out again, Chelsea, on the policy stuff." So maybe my enthusiasm you'll find it exciting. Then we'll talk about the different places that green infrastructure, EPA is really pushing for green infrastructure to be written into regulations. And Lauren's going to take us through some case studies in New York State, and then wrap up with sort of the challenges and opportunities that EPA has identified, and our own opinions too. But so another disclaimer: this is our opinions, not EPA's opinions. This is I've been away from EPA for a couple of years. So all right. So I'm going to start. I always like to start off with the Clean Water Act and bring the objective right to the front. It's to restore. This is the first line of the Clean Water Act that you read after the little part about the rules and regulations. This is like number 1: restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. I've repeated that sentence so many times in different contexts. It's something that when you talk about the Clean Water Act, that's what you emphasize. And then immediately following those are the 3 goals. There's actually 7, I think, but these 3 I really pull out and think that they're some of the most important. So this first one, we talked a little bit about it last time, is eliminate discharge of pollutants to navigable waters by 1985, right? So that's we've already, and then as an interim goal, you're gonna attain high water quality, and this protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreation in and on the water, that's shorthanded to fishable, swimmable, but really the full length there is to protect aquatic life and provide for recreation. And then the last part is to prohibit the discharge of toxic pollutants in toxic amounts. So this is sort of like repeating the first 2 goals, but it's really emphasizing that under no condition can you create a water body and sanction it in open sewer. So there can be no amount of toxics that are added to the water that would be toxic to any species, human or aquatic or whatnot. So these are 3 important goals. I think it's also important to note that even though we've passed these deadlines, this isn't like, your once you blow your New Year's resolution, like you forget about it. These dates actually hold a lot of weight in that we're still trying to work towards this goal. And even though we passed it, it's still, this first goal, I think especially, when you think about, it comes up a lot when we're emphasizing why anti-degradation policies are important and that's where the legal weight is this first goal. So that is my little spiel on the Clean Water Act. Then how EPA so the Clean Water Act was written in the legislature, and EPA takes and implements that and writes regulations, and they have this water quality-based approach.
Can I have a philosophical question?
Yeah.
Would you rather have a goal that's idealistic and sort of impossible to achieve, or would you have like a goal that's easy to achieve but it's not going the full way? I'm sort of conflicted. Whenever I see a lot of legislation, there is always that debate. What is your take on the Clean Water Act?
My take is that I do like the far-reaching, the unattainable
Okay.
goal, because I think what I've seen is like it allows for interpretation. It's really important to have a really strong piece of legislation, and I think I would say that maybe overly ambitious is stronger than under.
Okay.
I don't know. That's a.
No, it's not,
I don't
again,
have any
not
policy
a.
background to
No, that's fine. I mean,
think
just
about
maybe
it.
everybody can think about it at some point. But I think that's a useful question to
Yeah.
because a lot of things, when you set standards for something, I mean that's always the thing that comes up. Can you enforce it? Is it too ambitious, or should we just go for the most basic, threshold and then improve on it over time, which may or may not happen.
Right. I think it's in, well, yeah, I could talk about also, so much of the work was also, that we did was emphasizing all the flexibilities that we were offering to states, and the use attainability analysis came up, and we talked about that last week a little bit. Even though that's not perfect and not very helpful to revise your standards, there's still a big component of the standards that allows, like, if you can't economically do this, like, then you don't really have to meet the Clean Water Act. And so I feel like there's a delicate balance between those items and then this big goal. So yeah, it's an interesting question. So on the EPA side of implementing the Clean Water Act, in their 40 CFR regulations, they have these this water quality based approach to pollution. So there's kind of 4 components, I would say. This is, again, my perspective, is that you have these water quality standards, which have your uses for each water body. You're going to designate whether this is a cold water fishery, this is for recreating with boats, this is for swimming, or this is for another type of aquatic species. And then you have associated criteria with that. Then you're going to monitor those water bodies to make sure that they're attaining those standards, and assess I think it's in every several years, and you pick up a chunk of water bodies to look at. Every person that is discharging to that water body is required to receive a permit and comply with a permit. That's through the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES, I'm going to call it. And then there's this whole structure for when water bodies aren't meeting their their water quality standards, and they get listed on this 303D list, or impaired waters list, and then eventually, someday maybe, TMDLs get written for them, and water quality improves, ideally. So that's kind of what this structure looks like, is trying to say, is that you set your water quality standards, and you assess your water bodies and establish which water bodies or which pollutants are most important in those water bodies, and you define, maybe if you're under a TMDL situation, you're going to define how much can be added realistically to that water body and who all contributes. So this is where non-point sources come in, is under TMDLs. Non-point sources don't come into NPDES system. Then you're going to establish the source controls, which is just writing the permits. You're going to monitor and make sure that people are meeting their permits, and violators do get fined. And then you're going to, again, assess. So there's a couple different assessments, a couple different iterations of making sure your water body is managed. This process, I'm not sure I know of very many instances in which, like, people make the full circle on a single water body or a single pollutant. This framework is really loose, but this comes from the Water Quality Standards Handbook. And then the last thing I want to emphasize on these programs is that the Clean Water Act is a federal, so it's a federal law, right? And EPA implements. So actually the second part of the act is a whole line on states' rights, and so states are given. I'm not sure the right terminology for that, but like the authority to, they're gonna be the ones that are gonna implement the program. They're gonna write the regulations, to enact the Clean Water Act. And, EPA is really there as sort of like a parent, I would say. The states would, I think, hate for EPA to ever say that they were the parent in this situation, but EPA is still on the hook. If a state doesn't sort of meet the standards that are the goals of the act, then EPA is on hook, and so that's when we talked about citizen action suits, EPA does get wrapped into those. So the citizen might first sue the state, and then the state, eventually EPA does get wrapped into those lawsuits. All right, and then, but today's topic, we're gonna talk a lot about the permitting system. That's where green infrastructure is, they're really pushing for, that's where green infrastructure is gonna get involved. And I just wanted to go over that there are two different types generally of permits. We have individual permits and general permits. Individual permits are usually the ones we think of written for wastewater treatment plants or for factories that are discharging, just one pipe into the stream or a couple pipes. But they're usually big facilities, or they might have these individual permits are very site specific and they're like kind of like customized to the processes that are happening in that factory or treatment plant. The general permit is something that many people apply to, and it's a little bit more qualitative, and it has to do with, it's for programs or businesses that might have similar conditions, so like a dry cleaning operation. Most dry cleaners look like other dry cleaners, and so you can get a general permit. So I think that's some of the examples. So you have your traditional permits where a facility gets a permit to discharge. Then we also have some other sort of programs that are lumped under what OEGA or the enforcement office calls wet weather programs. So the stormwater program gets a different kind of permit. The permits look slightly different from what a wastewater treatment plant would get. The sanitary sewer overflow program also has some regulations, and the combined sewer overflow program has some regulations. And then the newest one that kind of is in and out of the permitting system is the animal feeding operations. So I'll go over the first three and talk about where green infrastructure gets plugged into each one of those and what EPA envisions, how EPA envisions that happening. So first to talk about the stormwater program, right? It's a subset of NPDES program with both general and individual permits. And these permits are regulating three different types of activities: the MS4s, the municipal sewer separate storm systems, construction activities, and industrial activities. So this is the stormwater that's coming off of construction sites and the stormwater that's coming off of maybe, I'm thinking like a steel yard. And so they get broken down by phase 1 and phase 2 based on sort of the size generally. This is just sort of EPA's estimates in 2009 of how many facilities. So with construction, you get only a permit for when you're doing construction, so it's a per year number there. But you see that we have a lot of smaller MS4s, much more than we do the large ones. So what an MS4 permit might look like is it has several different components. There's definitely a public education campaign to make sure that you don't, like, informing residents and users not to pour like motor oil down, the drain. You've all seen these public radio ads and pamphlets, I think, when you go to fairs and such. There's also another a component that looks at construction ordinances and makes sure that when sidewalks are being built that they're not dumping the concrete right into the drain, or those sorts of programs to make sure that small construction, even though they might fall under the general permit, this is sort of an overlap. Part of your stormwater permit, you also need to have a practice of mapping all of your outfalls to the stream, so where these pipes are going, where they are, and then have a program in place to track where unregulated discharges might happen. Someone might have connected, their, what do you call it? Sub pump, yeah, that's a frequent one, into the drain. And so, you need a program to go around and check that those are happening. What I think is important to note right now is that these permits, look really different than the permits that, a permit for a wastewater treatment plant, right, has numbers in it, and those are calculated from the stream that the plant is discharging to. It has time and frequency of when you're monitoring. It has records of what previous permits have been. It's much more quantitative. This, on the other hand, tends to be a lot more qualitative, and so that's a little dangerous, I think, in terms of regulating. So right then, there's what happens when sites that have been established for a long time. Is there a review process? EPA would like there to be a review process of which you're looking at different sites and understanding what their stormwater, if they're managing their stormwater properly. And of course, you need a monitoring and assessment program, which maybe I should put at the top because that's always cut out, but is really important. In New York State, I think it's pretty much what I've talked about at the federal level. I just wanted to add in a few more things. We have stormwater management. We have stormwater general permits for construction sites that are greater than an acre. So they have to implement these stormwater pollution protection plans, another qualitative sort of thing. There are some provisions in there for when you're discharging to impaired waters or waters with TMDLs. You would already, if you had a TMDL already developed for that water, it would probably already incorporate, would have gone back and changed the stormwater management plan. So where New York State has started to, so I'm gonna go a little bit into New York State right now. Does anybody have any questions about the federal stuff right now? Are you okay? Okay. So where New York State has started to really look at green infrastructure and how they're gonna add it in is in their new construction, in their new development and new construction. So they're requiring these new developments to have stormwater management practices in place in their, so many acronyms, I'm already forgetting what. Stormwater protection plan, protection plan, in there, and I think what's interesting to note in New York State's implementation is that, I'm not sure so I should be honest, I'm coming at thinking about green infrastructure as a really, in a broad way, and thinking about bioretention pond, or bioswales, all the way to really engineered like green roofs. So things that might naturally occur in the landscape and things that are very engineered. New York State, on the other hand, is parsing it, I think, in a really kind of arbitrary way. And so they're emphasizing really in new construction to conserve already green space, and they're calling that sort of green infrastructure. So this is a list of their stormwater management practices. These are not green infrastructure practices, but I might call them. So this is, these are Lauren's pictures. This is of the plantations, down by the plantations, that parking lot, that sort of like, maybe it's like a bioswale, right? And all the runoff from the parking lot and maybe from the field comes into this, and it's vegetated. This bioswale would be considered a regular old traditional stormwater management practice under New York State law. And then this is the filter in between two parking lots is the infiltration trench, or dry swale. And then this one is maybe like a shallow wetland that was originally designed as like detention basin. But so it's interesting. So these are maybe to make my point fully, I'll show you then what New York State considers green infrastructure practices to be. And these are like tree plantings and rooftop runoffs, stream daylighting, rain gardens, green roofs, stormwater planters. So they're a little bit more on the engineered, well, I don't think you can make that distinction. They're a little more newer practices, I think. And so maybe there's not as much information, scientific information out there about how well they work. And basically what you do with this, and Lauren, correct me here if I'm wrong on this, Lauren knows a little bit more, I think, about the New York State situation, but you implement these plans, you implement the stormwater practices, and you size them for however volume you need, right? And they say, okay, it's more practice oriented, it's not outcomes based, it's not saying like, well, we're gonna assume that it's gonna work.
And basically they're saying what's on these lists are approved practices, and that, you know, then the engineer can size them appropriately to deal with the right amount of runoff volume, but theoretically these practices will all do the sorts of water quality improvements generally that are desired.
Right, so that's interesting. And that's, I think, in contrast, what we heard from EPA and what they're looking for is not to say like, because you implemented this practice, it's gonna work. And we'll talk about what EPA is looking for in just a moment. So
Isn't it all about quantity, really? Like you're
Yeah.
basically saying that whatever construction you're doing, you can't increase the amount of stormwater that your municipal system sees.
You can't
So-
increase peak flow.
Right, so, yeah, it's peak, and it's based on peak flow. So during a storm event, it can't be more water reaching the sewer than there was before. And we don't care how you do it.
Yep.
You can do it any of these ways, as long as the quantity of water does not increase during a peak event.
right.
And so go for it.
And so that's yeah, exactly. So the permit is not only about quantity, but the permits aren't only about quantity, they're also about quality. And so that quality piece has not been addressed in the framework that we're describing. It's,
And also, we've been told, I mean, this is the reality part of it, because you get the SWIPs when, being on a planning board, the SWIPs can be 100 pages, you can get a whole DVD with a SWIP. But, yeah, they're huge, they can't for any kind of semi-sophisticated development. But we've been told there's only 2 people in the DEC who review all the SWIPs for the entire state. So they essentially don't review them, you just fill out a checklist, and they're just checking to make sure you filled out the checklist.
right, yeah, this
So-
is,
So they're a long way from getting to would this actually work?
right,
Yeah.
right.
Sorry to keep interrupting, but I just think it's important too, and I'm not sure it's like this in all areas, but I think people, let's just say, certain people are prone or liable to believe that the DEC is this enormous, not the DEC, but the EPA is this like ultra huge, overseeing agency that just has its hands in everything. And then you hear stories like this
Monster.
where it's just like, they don't have people, they can't even read the documents, there's nobody there.
Yeah.
So they don't even have enough staff to do the things that they promised they were gonna do. And so it's a bit of there's definitely dissonance between what people think the EPA is actually capable of and the number of people there who are even just barely keeping afloat in terms of like trying to do the jobs that they're supposed to do.
And similarly with the DEC, so the.
DEC would be the same.
Saying, and so to wrap it up, then a lot of how well this is implemented comes down to the municipal engineering staff and the engineering consultants that they hire.
Right.
If they do a good job, then it's being implemented pretty well, but there could be a lot of places they're not doing a good job.
Yeah, they could have a similar situation of not
Right.
really having the resources to.
Right, they just don't have
To
very
do it
talented
right.
people or the money to hire good people.
So we're gonna leave stormwater and we're gonna talk about those combined sewer and, the sewer overflow programs, the combined sewer overflow, and then the sanitary sewer overflows. They're just different in that the combined is combining stormwater and sanitary sewers, and then the sanitary sewers, are just supposed to go to, the wastewater treatment plant, but sometimes, there's pipe main breaks. Actually, the one near my family's home, I was just visiting this weekend, millions of gallons spilled into this creek that empties into the Schuylkill River from a pipe main break. It was actually, I just read, it's like the third one in this year. So that's like, there's something really scary going on, and the pipe's only 50 years old, which
Where is that?
this is in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. And it's right in the park, in Valley Forge Park. And it took 2 days to shut the main off, to find out how to shut the main off, and for the water, for there to stop being sewage directly entering the creek that enters then just a few miles, not even a mile down into the Schuylkill River. So these do happen, and I had the statistic, but I've forgotten it. It's something like up to 23,000 of these episodes happen a year, EPA estimates. So it's a significant thing that's happening. It has to do with this larger conversation that we're having about aging infrastructure and how we deal with that and where we notice it and when we don't, and how we really don't notice, I think, subterranean infrastructure as much. But the way, I think what I want to talk about in green infrastructure with the sewer overflow programs is that EPA is really about, especially with the sanitary sewer overflow, is about preventing these episodes from happening. And so that's where green infrastructure comes in, is by saying, if you implement green infrastructure, you might reduce your stormwater, your peak stormwater flows, that puts pressure on the system. And so you might you might increase your capacity of your system totally, and reduce the pressure on the gray side. So that's where they're going. And then the other places, and actually this slide doesn't give really enough credit to, this is where actually green infrastructure is happening, is in these places where things are going wrong, right? So you have the impaired waters and TMDLs being written, and then you have these consent decrees and enforcement orders. So consent decrees is like through the judicial process, someone sues, and there's an agreement had that someone, usually EPA, helps the state regulate, improve the regulations, and it might be for like a city, or it might be for an entire state, or it might be for a single water body. But those are sort of like, there's an agreement written, because these are, and then, enforcement orders are sort of, might be from the executive branch side where, and please correct me if I'm wrong in this, this is my understanding of the difference between consent decrees and enforcement orders, is that they come from two different branches of the government. The enforcement orders might come from the executive, and it might be done. I feel like we promulgated standards at EPA under the threat of lawsuit. So lawsuit is like just huge. It was amazing to me how much, that's really how things got done in that office. At EPA was just someone would say, hey, you're really not doing your job, EPA, I think I'm gonna sue you. And then that kind of like pushed, I think it really pushed, there was an interesting culture of, I think, so there's staff level people, and then there's political people, right? And so it just felt like there was a culture of, sometimes there's not enough momentum to convince the political appointees that action needs to be taken. And so the suing by an outside company was definitely, or an outside NGO was definitely something that would tip the, I can't think of what the metaphor is. Scale. Tip the scale, thank you.
Consent decrees are also mutual. I mean, everybody sort of agrees on certain set of standards and, a plan for a 10-year plan or 25-year plan or something.
Right. So it's maybe a little more similar to a TMDL, where there are people, everyone's coming to the table and sort of deciding on a plan. So why I'm bringing these things up and why we're seeing these things, green infrastructure going into these three places, is because these tend to be more site-specific projects that happen, I guess you could call them. They tend to be not as entrenched in what the way things were done before. So people are thinking, I think, a little bit more innovatively, and so because green infrastructure is this new thing, and you sort of need to innovate in order to figure out how it fits into the Clean Water Act and how it's going to help you meet your Clean Water Act goals, I think there's more room in here. So Philadelphia is an example. They're spending $2 billion under a consent decree on green infrastructure. They're spending a whole ton of money, just throwing at it, throwing green infrastructure at their infrastructure, in order to meet their consent decree. So, this is where the future is, I think, for green infrastructure.
Another thing that we've seen in some cities is that, in order to put in more hard infrastructure, more treatment plants, you have to site them somewhere in some neighborhood, and a lot of times you'll get a lot of political objection to that. Whereas if you're gonna say we're gonna put in green roofs and rain gardens and plant trees through the city, hey, you know, pervious parking lots, you know, that's not a big thing that people are gonna object to.
And that was specifically an issue with Syracuse, which I'll talk about
Yeah.
the Syracuse implementation, but yeah, there was
I think
concern
that's
that
in-
it was in marginalized communities, and
Right.
so, you know, their green infrastructure offered another better option for everyone.
And my sense is that it's been happening in several cities, so that's another kind of plus for green infrastructure.
Yeah.
Something people generally want in their neighborhood as opposed to who's, I think.
Right, and figuring out how to play up all of those co-benefits and
Yeah.
organize them, right? So there's some benefits to residents who are living nearby, there are benefits, we've talked about all the benefits. How to wrap those and get all of those people who might be interested in those other benefits to the table in creating this is one of the challenges, but also one of the great opportunities is linking different departments at the city level together. I think that's what one of our takeaways is at the end. So before, this is my wrap-up slide, and then I'm gonna hand it over to Lauren to talk about cases. But this is what EPA wants to be seeing in their regulations, in any regulations, when you're doing stormwater permitting, when you're doing consent decrees, when you're doing enforcement orders or TMDLs, is these are maybe the 6 things that you should be thinking about when you're implementing green infrastructure trying to get green infrastructure into your permitting system. So, first off, what we talked about with New York State, you wanna make sure that you're explicit about your terminology and what is green infrastructure, what you mean by that, what practices, fall under that, and you want that to be explicit about, that these are outcome-based, that these practices need to be performing. And then you need to define what performing means, right, with your metrics and how you're gonna decide if a practice is effective or not. You're gonna create compliance schedules. This is a general sort of like implementing new technology, what you do. You write in your permit, you have a compliance schedule. Your compliance schedules might look a little different than some new technology that you might put in your wastewater treatment plant. So because it is a more biological, there are other biological aspects to it. So the compliance schedule is a little different. You'll definitely need to incorporate reporting and monitoring and reporting. So reporting to whom and how frequently, and it needs to start basically right when you put that practice in, not when maybe it looks good and you're feeling like it's performing. You need to set up a way to enforce that these practices work, and a big part of why some of these practices fail is because there is not maintenance being done. I think Todd talked a little bit about that, I can't remember. But that is another big component that you need to explicitly write into your provisions. And then how, if someone was wanting to modify these practices, how they might modify the ones that you've already defined, or how once a practice is in place, how you would go about modifying it and ensuring that it's still meeting the water quality benefits and water quantity benefits that you originally designed for it. So with that, we're going to give it over to Lauren to talk about the cases that we
So
wanna
I'm
share.
going to talk about a couple of examples here in New York State, how green infrastructure is or is not being implemented currently. So as Chelsea mentioned, through these construction or development permits, New York is encouraging that engineers are thinking about these green infrastructure practices to satisfy those stormwater management requirements. But then the other main traditional stormwater permitting pathway is through these municipalities that are required to manage their stormwater. But as Chelsea showed us, those are more qualitative requirements that they have. They focus a lot on outreach and kind of just maintaining best management practices more than implementing new innovative practices. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the challenges with these small New York MS4s. A lot of municipalities across New York are classified as MS4s, and each year they're required to do an annual report to the DEC saying how they're meeting their permit requirements, what sort of outreach and best management practices are they carrying out, and how will they continue to improve that. And so one example I found was Putnam County, New York, which is down along the Hudson River in southern New York State. And so some example programs that they've been implementing as part of their MS4 permit include things like just mapping the drainage structures in their sewer shed, making sure they have really good maps of that, and mapping any illicit discharges like Chelsea was saying. Just some basic best management practices like street sweeping and catch basin cleaning, things like working with homeowners to upgrade faulty septic systems close to water bodies, partnering with like the Soil and Water Conservation District to do public outreach about stormwater. And then some new practices where there's really improvement needed, like restoration of stream reaches. But unless there is new development being made, there's often not these opportunities for green infrastructure. And some of these municipalities would like to implement more innovative stormwater practices, but as I know here in the challenges, one of the big issues is funding. So for the most part, unless there's some good funding source or there's other reasons, like maybe these co-benefits are really sticking out with a certain type of green infrastructure, they're not really going to jump into implementing some new practice. And on one of the reports that I found, they noted with relation to pollution control, although steady progress is being made in this area, the age of certain facilities makes compliance difficult without additional outside resources and or cooperation with neighboring municipalities. So that emphasizes the lack of funding to try to innovate, and also the challenges some of these smaller municipalities have in really moving towards some of these practices. And it's unfortunate because at the construction scale you're talking about one site, but these are kind of on a larger scale, and they have more opportunities to think about good ways to implement these practices. And so it's definitely, there's room for New York to try to help move towards pushing green infrastructure more, providing opportunities for that to be included in MS4 planning.
Hey, Lauren. Sorry to interrupt. Just saying that I'm just passing around the general stormwater permit for New York, just in case people want to look. For construction activity, and there's one for industrial activity. There's also one for hydraulic fracturing, but you can forget that one. Sorry.
I was
So,
gonna ask, what is stream reach? I think you had that, restoration.
So basically a section of a stream. So there was a particular section that was really eroded in this county, and so they felt like that was probably contributing to a lot of sediment, and so they decided to put funding. They collaborated with some NGO, I think, and restored, like maybe a couple hundred meters of a particular stream that was really degraded. So the next two cases I'll talk about are moving towards other ways that green infrastructure is really being implemented in New York, and that in both cases has to do with managing combined sewer overflows, because as Chelsea said, they're forced to make changes to deal with these things, and so there's this opportunity to either go with the traditional methods or change it up. You're going to have to spend money, and so they have this opportunity to make these choices. And so first is Onondaga County, which is the area around Syracuse. And since the late 80s, that was when they got originally sued about having all these combined sewer flows going into Onondaga Lake and causing a lot of water quality problems there. So in the late 80s, they had their first consent decree, which said that Onondaga County would start implementing a bunch of gray infrastructure practices like underground storage tanks and some basic primary treatment facilities to capture these overflows so that they wouldn't just be directly discharging into the lake. But then, Syracuse started to realize there was some community outcry about where some of these treatment facilities were being implemented, and they realized they were going to spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars to meet these needs, and so perhaps green infrastructure could provide this opportunity to also get other benefits out of it. And so in 2009, they amended that consent judgment, which incorporated green infrastructure in addition to gray infrastructure in their plan. And so they had gotten up to somewhere in the 80% of prevention of combined sewer overflows, but then they added in green infrastructure, saying that they would capture 6.3% of combined sewer overflow volume with green infrastructure, bringing their total control to the requirement of 95% prevention of CSOs. And so in the consent decree, it's noted that for this green infrastructure, they have to document the project specs for all the different projects that are implemented. There has to be documentation of operation and maintenance practices. The county is required to monitor that the overflows are actually being reduced, and they're required to use an EPA model, the stormwater management model, to also show how these practices are reducing trends. So as scientists, we might say this model, it assumes certain functionalities and reductions for these practices, which I'll note later is something we can continually improve our understanding of. And then they have to conduct public outreach related to this green infrastructure to really get that stakeholder buy-in and get the citizens behind this implementation. And then of course we come to the money. To really implement this green infrastructure, the city can do it on their property, but a lot of the city is going to be businesses and residential property, and so the city is allocating a lot of funds to give grants to residents and businesses where they'll propose green infrastructure projects and they'll be implemented with funds from the county. In addition to that, they have a separate funding line which is targeted towards municipalities within their MS4 where, like I was saying before, the MS4s are always challenged to have kind of these innovative practices because they don't really have, great funding sources. And so this is giving an opportunity to channel some money towards doing things like making sure people aren't dumping their sump pumps down the water lines and implementing some infiltration basins around some of these different municipalities, things that could help a little bit reduce those flows coming into the sewer system. And just some examples of what they're actually implementing here. I'll note all this comes off their website, which is savetherain.us. It's really great. It literally has every project they've implemented thus far. On the top left there, you'll see Interstate 690. They have a lot of interstates crossing Syracuse City. The water was just being channeled right down into the storm sewer system. And so they've disconnected some of these runoff downspouts and actually channeled those into little treatment swales. I think Brian talked on the first day about the huge green roof that's on the convention center in Syracuse, and beyond that they've implemented a lot of other green roofs. I mentioned how some of these municipalities have gotten grants to do things like add infiltration basins in or implement porous sidewalk or porous pavement. And then in the city, they have a couple different initiatives too with citizens to give out rain barrels to get people to collect their rainwater. And then they're also working with some vacant lots that they have across the city to try to green those and make that more of a nice public environment that's also having benefits of taking out stormwater. So this is just a small picture of the many different things that they're implementing. And then New York City is similarly has recently amended their consent decree, which did before only focus on gray infrastructure as their way of trying to reduce these combined sewer overflows, to in 2012 incorporating green infrastructure. And so they have some pretty ambitious goals. And so the way that they're framing their plans is that they intend to control 1 inch of stormwater generated by 1.5% of the city's impervious surface using green infrastructure, with the goal of this happening by the end of next December. And then they have a plan to ramp up those percentages to 4% in 2020 and 10% in 2030. And to meet all of these goals, they're dedicating $187 million now, with a total of $2.5 billion over 20 years to meet this green infrastructure implementation. In their plans, they have, they note that there will be performance metrics and implementation schedules to meet these goals. So many of these things that Chelsea mentioned that the EPA lays out as these things that are really important to making sure that this green infrastructure is actually going to do what it's intended to. And then in terms of actually trying to meet these metrics, allowing for contingency plans so that if you're not seeing the reductions that are intended, that they then can make a contingency plan and say, well, okay, this is how we're going to try to rectify the fact that we're failing to meet this at the moment. And so including adaptive management in this process. And up here, there's just a picture of this little bioswale, which is the main way that New York City, one of the main ways that New York City is implementing green infrastructure. So Onondaga County is taking this pretty diverse approach where they're using all these different types of techniques. But in New York City, they're kind of focusing on a smaller set of tried and true or kind of adaptively managed specific practices. And this one I think they're calling like a street side bioswale. But basically they've designed it so it's kind of a trench in the sidewalk where they've dug down and amended the soil with a really porous media that has organic matter to stimulate biological activity, and a really diverse series of plantings, and then some sort of tree there, and there's runoff being routed into here. And so these are being implemented with a partnership between the Department of Environmental Protection, which is in charge of dealing with all these water quality standard issues, but then they're also partnering with the Department of Parks and Recreation, which are the ones who are in charge of maintaining these and designing them, and then also the Department of Transportation, which has jurisdiction over all those sidewalks. So it's forcing these Novell partnerships to implement things like this. And so we'll see. They've said that already they've kind of had to adjust the design for this as they're seeing that certain things don't work, not just in terms of the water function, but just things like people stepping out of cars and stepping on the plants, or people putting their dogs inside it if it was all fenced around. So just finding ways like that to actually make these work in the city and have the citizens buy into them. So, stepping back and taking a look at all the different challenges that exist. So as we've said multiple times, ensuring and fully understanding as much as we can what is the functionality in many different respects of these infrastructure types in order to actually be able to meet desired water quality standards. You need to make sure that you have suitable soils to be able to implement this green infrastructure. It's not like a one-size-fits-all sort of approach. In terms of cities actually being able to feasibly implement this, they need to make sure that their local ordinances are in line with these different sorts of infrastructure implementations. The issue of land ownership kind of comes into this. As I mentioned, Syracuse is having to provide grants and partner with private landowners to try to get them to implement the practices, because they're a large chunk of the landowners around the city. And so finding ways to make that happen, and then ensure these private landowners will agree to then maintain those practices to ensure that they're continuing to work. And that, of course, brings me to this, to having plans for what are the standards for maintenance and ensuring that they actually are being maintained so that they'll then maintain this functionality. And making sure that the citizens are educated about what this green infrastructure does, why it's here, and what are the benefits that they can get out of it. And then, of course, dealing with the issue of funding this sort of infrastructure. And so along the same lines of that, how can we solve some of these things? Well, you know, us scientists and engineers need to keep studying these and better understand how they're functioning under different conditions, what are all these co-benefits, and, you know, making sure that's communicated to the people that, you know, need to make the designs and make the decisions. Adaptive management is definitely going to be a part of this process, so the idea that you make a design and you implement it, but you come back and you check on it, and if it's not working like it is, then you think about how that can be modified to actually make it function as it's desired. Also, this idea that not just kind of implementing green infrastructure wherever who wants to put it on their property, but thinking about where it could be the most effective. So Syracuse, when they made those grant programs for private property, they targeted certain parts of the city that were in those sensitive areas with the highest incidence of contribution to combined sewer overflows, so that theoretically, if these practices were implemented there, they would actually do the most to make reductions of stormwater runoff. Finding innovative ways to try to solve this funding issue. Philadelphia has talked about some public-private partnerships they're trying to work on to fund their ambitious infrastructure goals. Some cities are starting to think about stormwater or impervious surface fees as a little fee on like your tax bills that would contribute towards being able to build these practices that theoretically would benefit everyone. And then just kind of touching upon this, but not really getting into it much, but the EPA kind of has hopes that that it could be beneficial for municipalities to move towards integrative planning and thinking about how they're managing their stormwater and wastewater. Like, this runoff from the landscape is affecting both of these, but the way it is, you're permitted to deal with your wastewater separately and your stormwater separately, and sometimes it's coming together with combined sewer overflows. But ultimately you have to meet these same water quality goals for the Clean Water Act. So finding ways that you can kind of get the most bang for your buck in terms of implementing practices that could be beneficial to all the different things that you need to deal with. And then just bringing it together with a couple of the takeaway messages that we wanted to give you guys. Green infrastructure projects must demonstrate measurable water quantity and quality benefits, the quantity kind of being like the reducing those combined sewer overflows, but ultimately that is going towards ensuring that we have good quality water bodies here in the United States. The permitting program is not practice-based, but it should be outcomes-based in terms of ensuring that water quality. And we really need to be able to understand and characterize the uncertainty of these practices, these green infrastructures, in terms of trying to avoid broken promises, getting municipalities to buy into these and jumping on the bandwagon and implementing things that might not achieve those goals that they're looking to get to. And really, this is going to be a learning process. Like, the EPA, the states, the supporting NGOs, everyone is adapting, and we're getting new information, and we're figuring out better what's the best way to plan these things and how are they working, and so it'll continue getting better. Really, those co-benefits are what really makes green infrastructure better than gray infrastructure. Gray infrastructure focuses on pretty much one thing, and green infrastructure sometimes can be more expensive, sometimes could even be cheaper, but then it has all these other co-benefits it could provide. And so thinking about that in this kind of comprehensive planning in cities and how we could really harness that and really leverage that and yeah, again, just planning for multiple things and really figuring out how one thing could also help you deal with another problem, and in that way be able to kill two birds with one stone and maybe save some money. So with that, I think that's pretty much it. Do you have anything else to add?
comments?
You know, there's the different approaches, like, Rochester just built a bunch of really, really, really big tunnels. And so they divert their stormwater, into these tunnels when it rains really hard, and then they store it there, and then they release it slowly. You can like drive a truck through the tunnels, so they're really, really big. I wanna get a tour, but I haven't gotten it
Yeah,
yet.
and DC is kind of going for that same hybrid approach. I read something funny where it's like they have this little like, they feel like, oh, we're not as good as Philly, you know, like we don't have all the green infrastructure that they do, but they just decided for them, like, it was the right decision to go for some of these big tunnels, but then not have to build them quite as big and also implement some green infrastructure in these kind of highly sensitive parts of the sewer shed. So, you know, these cities are kind of choosing what's the right balance for them and what they're willing to maybe take some risk on.
So are these like underground tunnels?
Yeah.
And it's like big storage tanks?
And Buffalo has been buying back the abandoned properties in its city, and so it costs money to actually demolish a house, right? So it's kind of a big deal because they're actually taking down the houses. So if it's an abandoned lot or a building that's not meeting code anymore, they're actually, instead of paying to do some of these approaches, they're paying to demolish the houses, and then they're leaving it, and then they're replanting, and they're calling that an approach to stormwater management. Just two things that, so everybody seems to be taking a slightly different approach.
And I actually read today that Buffalo just got a $500,000 EPA grant to add more green infrastructure, and I guess it's part of some Great Lakes focused
Sure.
coastal water quality program, so.
Yeah, so a couple of months ago, there's someone, Catherine Tobin, her name, she's kind of the governor's point person on these big projects, like.
Margaret.
Was it Margaret Tobin? Okay, and she was in Buffalo, and one of her issues, she said, was that, and I was gonna ask you about this, is like, how do we know if we implement X amount of green infrastructure and we pay X dollars for it, how much pollution reduction are we gonna get? Because that's what people wanna see, they wanna see those kind of numbers, and, presumably that comes down to the models at this point.
Yeah, I think.
And how good are they even within an order of magnitude, or?
Yeah, I think that's the big question. Like in pretty much everything I read, it's all about that water quantity goal, with the assumption that reducing combined sewer overflows will eventually get you to that quality goal. And there's, I think part of that burden is on us to better quantify the functionality of these things, and then actually incorporating that into some of these attainable goals.
Yeah.
This is the interesting thing. I think I was just talking to Todd about how USDA, with their best management practices, funds a lot of science to go and figure out the effectiveness of practices as they're sort of going in, but sort of ahead of it. EPA doesn't put as much money into research dollars, I think.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of going at this by put this in, figure out as you go along what it's doing and how well it's doing it, instead of and hope for the best. But I think we do risk these broken promises type things where.
And it's also then how much money is getting put into all this assessment and monitoring. I mean, it's a big task, and you don't necessarily see huge amounts of money, out there to say, oh, we're gonna fund you to assess green infrastructure, right? I mean, so without that, how are we gonna improve our knowledge of how well these are working and improve the system?
Yeah, and I frankly don't think that EPA's stormwater management model can capture that water quality aspect very well right now.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point too, because depending on how you frame what problem are you trying to solve, and if the public is wanting a water quality improvement, and if in their mind that's what they're seeing as the problem to be solved, but that's not the problem that's necessarily being directly addressed through the project implementation, then you have that misalignment, and then sort of you're back to the broken promises piece.
Well, and it even gets more complicated, because a lot of times the public will kind of glom on to the water quality issues like the southern end of Cuba Lake, like phosphorus, oh my word, we're polluted, we're terribly polluted, we've gotta reduce phosphorus. And it's like, okay, but they don't how many people care about phosphorus? A few scientists maybe, but no one really cares about phosphorus. But they feel, oh, there's an increase in aquatic vegetation. That's what they really, and they're sure that has to do with phosphorus, but it may not have anything to do with phosphorus. So then you also get into what do they really think is the problem, and whether the standards are really, how closely related they are to what people think is the problem in any particular water body. So you could go out and reduce phosphorus, and you still have a lot of aquatic vegetation in the southern end of Cuba Lake. So, but trying to get, so that's also becomes extremely difficult when you have a standards-based approach to maintaining water quality. It has some advantages, but then these disadvantages, I think. So it's interesting to see. So I was going to point out too on this first slide the navigable waters things, because for a whole long time it's like, what are navigable waters? But of course that's they have to put that in there because it's the only justification for the federal government to be involved in any of this. Because the federal government has a certain amount of power over navigable waters. But now, I mean, you guys may be involved with this more than me, but navigable waters even got into ephemeral streams. I mean,
wetlands and streams.
Wetlands and so on, and now people are arguing, a first order stream is not, in the most part, a navigable water, and so the federal government shouldn't have any say, and these kind of standards should not have any say,
And the hydrologist would say that that's like potentially the most sensitive.
Exactly,
area.
exactly, so so it's interesting.
EPA just issued a order today, a CFR.
Yeah, with the US Corps, right?
With the Corps on standards on navigable waters.
Yeah, on Water to the US, that whole, they were like, we had a Water to the US lawyer who would just come in and advise on that. If ever we were talking about where standards apply or where they don't apply.
Water
we had
to
Debbie
the
in.
US.
Yeah, she's gonna tell you what is and what is not, because it's very tricky, yeah.
Interesting.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.